Listen to me. I never told nobody this, but when I was in that coma, something happened to me. I went someplace, I think. That's Tony Soprano from The Sopranos, which came out in 1999 and ran until 2007. There's now been a resurgence of interest in The Sopranos. In fact, during the pandemic, there was a 179% increase in viewers of The Sopranos on HBO Now, this streaming service. And there's this new movie coming out, a prequel to The Sopranos called The Many Saints of Newark. Tony Soprano in the show is fictional, obviously. He's a crime boss. There was a guy named Saul who, like Tony Soprano, had ordered the murder of many people. In fact, he was ordering the murder of Christians when Christianity first began. And then the same person who ordered the murder of Christians was converted to Christianity. And then Saul becomes known as Paul, and he writes much of the New Testament. Paul, like Tony Soprano, travels somewhere. So that opening line I was telling you about, Tony Soprano is talking about having gone somewhere while he was in a coma. And it was a tormenting place. It was a dispiriting, confusing place. It was a realm that he did not want to return to. And it changed him, at least temporarily, to have gone to this other realm. Paul also went to another realm. Tony Soprano's realm was disorienting, destabilizing. The realm that Paul goes to is a glorious realm. It's a heavenly realm. And I want to argue today that when we look at what happens with Tony Soprano traveling to another realm and the Apostle Paul traveling to another realm, we will find an answer to one of life's most important questions. What is our greatest power in the midst of difficulty in our life? Again, what is the greatest power we have in the midst of difficulty in our life? We're going to turn to both Tony Soprano and the Apostle Paul to find our answer today. To address this question of the what is the greatest power that we have in the midst of life's difficulties, let's talk about what our greatest problem is that we face in life, specifically in our spiritual lives. There's a guy named John Newton, a priest at St. Michael's Episcopal Church in Austin, Texas, who wrote a book called New Clothes. And in this book, he addresses what he believes to be our greatest spiritual problem. This is what he says. He says, I believe that our great spiritual problem is that we are terrified we have no value. And so we try and produce it. We build an image we think the world will accept, and we make our life about refining that image. This sounds like a response to shame, right? That terror we have that maybe we're not very valuable. And maybe other people either know this or they're going to figure it out about us. John Bradshaw said this about shame. To feel shame is to feel seen and exposed in a diminished way. To feel seen and exposed in a diminished way. Again, that fear that we will be seen as someone who is not valuable. This is an idea in the Bible. From the very earliest pages of the Bible, the writers are talking about shame. The story in Genesis of God creating original humanity, placing original humanity in this paradise where there are all kinds of trees that are pleasant to the eyes and producing fruit that are pleasant to the taste. And God says, enjoy this abundance. This is for you. This is part of our loving relationship between God and humanity. There's one tree that you're not to eat from, and that tree is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The rest of this garden, paradise, is filled with pleasantries. It's filled with grace. It's filled with provision from God. And what does original humanity do? They eat from the one tree in this place of great abundance Their focus is on this one tree that they're not supposed to eat from. And sin enters the world, and sin enters the world with a very specific consequence. It brings shame. So Adam and Eve are naked, and they're living authentic selves in authentic relationship with God and each other. And suddenly, when sin enters the picture, they experience shame. They're aware of their nakedness and they're ashamed by it. Again, what does John Bradshaw say? He says that to feel shame is to feel seen and exposed in a diminished way. This is what happens to Adam and Eve. So they do what John Newton was saying is a great spiritual problem we have of trying to cover up our feelings of insecurity, our feelings of shame with some cover of our own making. And in this case, they sew fig leaves together and create loincloths. They try to cover their shame. They feel seen and exposed in a diminished way, and they take what actually was part of the provision of God of these fig trees, and they repurpose it in this distorted way. They try to cover themselves to create a different image so that what they believe is their lack of value will not be perceived by God or each other. In fact, they run and hide from God because they feel seen and exposed in a diminished way. This is what happens to Tony Soprano. After he has his medical crisis, after he is in the hospital with a coma, he travels spiritually to this disorienting, tormenting realm. And when he comes out, he's physically diminished. He doesn't have the same strength. And there's one scene in the show where he's looking around at his colleagues, at these fellow mafia members. And he notices that even the older guys look like they still have some musculature to their arms. But Tony feels diminished. He says, he laments that, man, I was in there and I didn't lose any fat, I just lost muscle mass. And so what is he going to do? Feeling seen and exposed in a diminished way, he's going to try and find a loincloth. Like Adam and Eve, he's going to try to cover up his feeling of weakness, his feeling of insecurity, his feeling of shame. And in this case, what he does is he scans the room for the beefiest, most muscular guy he can find in the room, and he picks a fight with him, and he beats him up. So he covers up his feeling of diminishment, his feeling of weakness, his feeling of shame, with his loincloth, in this case, is his brute strength. He still has enough of that brute strength from all his years of fighting and beating people up to take out this really muscular young guy. Behind closed doors, Tony Soprano immediately goes and vomits from the physical exertion. But in front of everyone else, this is his loincloth, his brute strength. This is his image that he feels like he has to maintain and prop up, or else his weakness, his shame, his lack of value, his perceived lack of value will be exposed to everyone else. What is your loincloth? What's my loincloth? They can be good things on the surface. Remember, the fig leaves that Adam and Eve take to create the loincloths, these are provisions from God. So they can be good things that we repurpose and distort to try and prop up our image. Is it your professional success, which can be a good thing in itself, but if you're using that professional success to prop up your strength, to create an image out of fear that you lack value without it, that you're only valuable because of your professional accomplishments, then you, like Adam and Eve, have distorted this blessing, this gift, this grace from God, and you're now using it as a loincloth. Is it the success of your children? Is it your intellect, your good looks, your athletic prowess? Is it your spirituality? Some people tend to, they're very religious. They read sacred texts all the time. They're very proud of their devout spiritual state or their devout spiritual interests. And they wear this, even something that ostensibly is good, they wear it as a loincloth because deep down they don't feel valuable. They feel like this spiritual commitment that's obvious to everyone else. This will show that I'm valuable, that I'm strong. It can be dangerous, so dangerous that the Apostle Paul, when he has his travel, so Tony Soprano goes to some realm that is tormenting. By contrast, again, the Apostle Paul goes to the paradise. He goes to this heavenly realm. And he says, whether it's in the body or out of the body, I don't know exactly what was happening to me, but I received revelations I can't even talk about, he says. So this is all covered, by the way, in a New Testament letter called 2 Corinthians, and it's chapters 12, verses 2 to 10. He says, I went to this other realm and I received revelations, glorious revelations that I'm not even allowed to speak about. But there is danger in these revelations, in this incredible spiritual experience of becoming a loincloth for Paul that he could wear when he felt diminished, when he felt not very valuable. He could wear these spiritual revelations. He could boast about these spiritual revelations to people. So what does God do? God actually sends Paul a messenger of Satan that torments him, Paul says. God sends a messenger of Satan to torment Paul because of the great danger in these spiritual revelations that Paul has received of becoming a loincloth, to cover a sense of weakness or shame or vulnerability. And Paul prays 3 times, God, please take this away from me. Take this torment away from me. And God does not take it away. Have you ever had an unanswered prayer? Have you ever pleaded with God in a situation that was tormenting, that was extremely difficult, and you felt like God did not answer that prayer, and by extension, God must not be noticing you. God must not be receiving your prayers. But that's not what happened for Paul. Paul pleaded, take this tormenting experience away from me. We don't know what the thorn in the flesh was. This messenger of Satan with the thorn of the flesh that torments Paul. Some think it could have been a chronic illness, maybe a problem with anxiety. Maybe it was the persecution he continually faced when he would proclaim the Christian gospel in various places. It could have been any number of things, and that's a blessing for us as we read this, because whatever it is, whatever difficulty we face in our life, whatever cross it seems like we have to bear, whatever thorn it is in our flesh, it applies. Because in our difficulty, God says the same thing that he says to Paul when Paul pleads for him to take these difficult circumstances away, taking this thorn in the flesh away. This is what happened. Paul says, beginning in verse 8, 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me, but he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. What is grace? Here's what the Catechism of the Catholic Church says about grace. Grace is favor, the free and undeserved help that God gives us to respond to his call to become children of God. Grace is attached to our unshakable identity as beloved children of God who will be children of God forever in eternity. Again, the Catechism of the Catholic Church, grace is favor, the free and undeserved help that God gives us to respond to his call to become children of God, partakers of the divine nature and of eternal life. It's interesting in that Genesis account we were talking about, where Adam and Eve create loincloths for themselves out of the fig trees. Actually, God then clothes Adam and Eve. He provides suitable clothing for Adam and Eve. This is an act of grace. This is undeserved help. They've tried to construct something that isn't really suitable for them. God constructs something that is suitable and pleasing, even in the midst of their sin. This is grace, undeserved favor. And this is what Paul is saying, that in the midst of our difficulties, in the midst of our weaknesses, when we think we're at our lowest point, The good news is that God's power is made perfect in our weakness. God's grace is sufficient for us to find inner resources to keep going, and not only to keep going in some kind of dour, depressed state of trudging ahead, putting one foot in front of the other, but to enjoy the abundance of grace even in the midst of difficulties. It's to turn our eyes onto the grace and the sufficiency of God's power in the midst of our weaknesses, in the midst of our difficult circumstances. So Tony Soprano, when he comes out of the hospital and he's feeling diminished physically and even emotionally and spiritually, and he's looking around at everyone, he puts on his loincloth by picking a fight with this one guy to show off his strength because he feels diminished inside. He's scared that he's being seen and exposed as not valuable, as not strong. And all of these colleagues he has in the room are also potential rivals. Paul writes his story, it's a true life account according to Paul, of going to another realm, of going to heaven, receiving these incredible revelations that are so astounding that he could have very easily got spiritually conceited. And then God sends a messenger of Satan that creates a thorn in the flesh for him so he won't be conceited. He won't be tempted to use this unique spiritual revelation he's received as some kind of loincloth. Paul writes all this in the midst of having rivals to his leadership. So in Corinth, this place, this church in Greece where Paul is writing, there are these people who are leaders or would-be leaders who are bragging about all their spiritual accomplishments, bragging about their erudite skills, their oratory skills, that they're really astounding speakers. And they're saying by extension, Paul, this guy, kind of has shabby appearance. Certainly doesn't sound like a great speaker. That's your leader? And they're rivals to Paul's leadership in Corinth. They're saying, they're bragging about their spiritual superiority. So Paul could have done what Tony Soprano did and tried to find some loincloth and brag about it. But even when he's talking about going to another realm and receiving revelations, he undercuts it and says, hey, I wasn't blessed with this experience to brag about it. I was actually given a thorn in the flesh to make sure that I would know I'm not going to brag about my accomplishments. I'm not going to put on some kind of loincloth. I am instead going to receive the provision from God, the grace of God. Because when I do that, I know that when I'm weak, then I'm really strong. God's power is made perfect in our weakness. Even Tony Soprano gets a hint of this when he is talking to a kind of rival crime boss from another family who also has a medical crisis. And Tony, now having largely recovered from his own medical crisis, he tells him something he hasn't told anyone else. And that's what I started off this talk with. He says, listen to me. Now, I never told nobody this, but while I was in that coma, something happened to me. I went someplace, I think. But I know I never want to go back there. And maybe you know what I'm talking about, he says to this guy. And going back there, it's some unpleasant realm, other than heaven, other than an earthly realm. And Tony says to this guy, now take your time. You get better. You get out of this place. And when you do, you focus on good things. So Tony has had a glimpse of grace. He's tempted, and he does, take a loincloth and cover up his feeling of inadequacy and weakness. But in this private moment with this would-be rival, Tony offers grace from his experience. He finds out what Paul finds out in a more powerful, steady, life-changing way. And that is that in the midst of our difficulties, we can turn and focus on the good things. That is the grace of God. Every good and perfect thing comes from above. That's what the New Testament says in the book of James. Every good and perfect thing. When we are weak, in the midst of difficulties, in the midst of those temptations of feeling like I must not be doing the right thing for these really difficult circumstances to be befalling me, when we start to feel that shame, when we start to feel that lack of worthiness, we can stop and we can focus on the grace of God. What we have in our lives, the good gifts we have in our lives, and the good gifts that God is going to continually pour out on us, since every good and perfect thing comes from above. Grace is made perfect in weakness. God's power is displayed in our weakness. If you're in a difficult situation right now that you can't seem to change, there is good news. God is with you tangibly, pouring out grace, pouring out help, help that's here and help that is to come. Do not be ashamed. Be clothed in the righteousness of God. You are valuable. You are irreplaceable to God, to people who love you in your lives. You are a light in the darkness. Continue to shine and thrive even in the midst of your difficulties, especially in the midst of your weakness, because Christ will be strong in your weakness. God is sufficient for you in your weakness. And may you be blessed in every area of your life with peace and joy and happiness, even in the midst of some situations of sorrow. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.